Thank you so much again. You'll see people kind of trickling in and out because we have 3 different sessions today. One is a great conversation and talk from Dr. Wendy Charles, and then we'll have 3 amazing lightning round talks of about 20 minutes apiece. And then we'll have a networking hour here in the back. It's a beautiful day. We love this space for the view here, so we're very excited and thankful to the Corbell School for having us in this space. We did want to let everybody know because we have such an awesome jam-packed group and we wanted to make sure we're utilizing their expertise to the best of our abilities. We'll do the full presentations, and then during the reception, there will be time for Q&A with the specific speakers. So it'll be more organic, more face-to-face, and so we'll all gather in the back here as we do that. But for now, thank you so much for coming to the second symposium after the fall. We were very thrilled to have an introduction by Professor Josh Ross, then an amazing panel in the fall, and then we had use case breakout sessions. And then we decided we would love to do a follow-up because it was such a wonderful conversation with so many people on campus. And so today we will have an amazing run of show and we'll talk through that. But before we do start, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Community Plus Values and the University of Denver really tries to start with that, to take a moment in the spirit of healing and peace to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples of the land upon which the university stands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes. Like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is a complex and sometimes painful. And in recognition of this fact and to underscore the commitment in our community, we commit to listen and affirm the stories of all in our community. And we do invite you to visit the DU Native American Indigenous Initiative's website and to follow the Native Student Alliance on social media. And they're actually going to have the New Beginnings powwow on May 13th. So mark your calendars. It'll be right here on the University of Denver campus. And it'll be centered around transforming Indigenous brilliance. So I want to start with that. And now I'm excited. Provost Mary Clark has been able to join us today in her busy schedule to kick us off. And so with that, I will hand it over to Provost Clark.
Thank you, Chase. And I benefit from all of Chase's work. He has organized today's event with so many of you who are present, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. So to our faculty, staff, students, our deans, I very much appreciate your partnership in this second level blockchain symposium that we're hosting today. As Chase highlighted, we had a session in the fall that was really a bit of an appetizer or a teaser about blockchain. Our timing was magnificent because it was, I think, the very day that all hell broke loose with blockchain in the financial domain. And so we are now building on that and really building on that very meaningfully by engaging directly in the ethics of blockchain. And so we have some very special speakers joining us today to be thinking about that next level consideration of blockchain. It is with us. It is with us for the future. What is our contribution uniquely as the University of Denver with our commitment to the public good? What is our unique contribution to this domain? How might we shape it? So following what I am very much looking forward to as our introductory talk about the ethics of blockchain with Dr. Wendy Charles, we'll have 3 lightning talks. Chase made reference to them. Professor Chris Coleman, who will be talking about this work, especially in the domain of arts. Matt Romo-Nichols, president of the Web3 Club. Thank you for joining us. And then finally, Will Wizard, owner of Red Road Legal, who will be talking about some of the legal implications of this, which we just began looking at the end of our fall blockchain symposium. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Wendy Charles. Dr. Charles is Chief Scientific Officer at Burst IQ and also a faculty member here at our Health Informatics and Information and Communications Technology program in University College. And so we're just so pleased to have Dr. Charles with us. And my apologies in advance, I'll be stepping out during Dr. Charles's remarks, which is really my loss, but we're so pleased to have you here. And thank you again to Chase. We just build on the foundation of all of your thought leadership and organizing talents. So thank you.
All right, in true technological form, we are going to change over to a presentation here from Dr. Wendy Charles. There you go.
Okay, do you have the clicker right there too?
It's right there.
Should I turn off this one? Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I am so delighted to be joining you today, and I'm thrilled to be a member of the DU community. So I am thrilled to also talk about my true passion, which is blockchain, and to help you understand some more of the nuances of blockchain so that it can help us all move forward. So starting out, I wanted to offer a disclaimer that the views in this presentation are mine and not necessarily of my employer or of DU, that I work for a company that provides blockchain services, and I will be talking about the work that I do, but my goal is not to be promotional. And I have lots of pictures in this presentation, some of which I drew, some of which I got from Google. I just wanted you to know for any of the images I got from Google, they are intended to be educational, not necessarily representative. So I come from a diverse background, and I thought it would be helpful to provide a tidbit of my background so that you can understand where my perspectives come from. So I have a PhD in health information technology with clinical science with a focus in health information technology. And so I treat blockchain as a form of health information technology. And I have almost 30 years of conducting clinical research, and I work full-time for a company that designs health blockchains. And so my focus then is, how do we utilize blockchain as a complex technology? And because I work in the commercial space, how do we make commercial applications of blockchain? I will also be talking about in my presentation some of my work on international committees. We just recently finished an international standard for IEEE on the governance of blockchain. And through my presentation, I'll talk about my work with the European Commission as well. So starting out, what is blockchain? Because this is such a difficult question, I thought I would start with some cautions. So I am asking the audience, many of you have heard of blockchain or have some familiarity. I'm asking you to keep an open mind about the blockchain features and recognize that there are many types of blockchains, and also that blockchains are constantly evolving. So some might say, well, gosh, you talk about all this work that you do. Why haven't I heard more? Well, there's two analogies that I'd like to use. The first is that just like a tree, any technology has to get its roots. And a lot of the work that's being done is being done so-called underground or in pilot stages, or that people are just developing a firm foundation, and then we'll talk more about the products that they release. Also, it's valuable to know that within a commercial product, that blockchain is only 10 to 15% of the architecture stack. And so companies may not feel that they need to talk about the underlying technology for their architecture stack. And in reality, consumers only care about how the technology works. And they don't necessarily ask about, well, what server did you use? Or what cloud service provider do you use? They just want to know that the technology works. And quite honestly, for us, our work at First IQ, many of our customers don't even tell their consumer base that they use blockchain because they're worried that their consumer base would be confused. So that's why you may not have heard as much, but I hope that with my presentation, you really see how much is going on. So now we'll address the issue, what is blockchain? And it's important to know that there is no single or correct definition of blockchain. And actually, if you ask 10 different blockchain experts for a definition of blockchain, you will receive 11 different definitions. On the IEEE committees on which I served to create standards, they had nothing but blockchain experts from around the world. And we had debates that looked just like this. Hour-long, drag-out, knockout debates about the definition of blockchain. In fact, that looks an awful lot like me. So let's break down some of these concepts so that we collectively as a group can move forward. So first, many people associate blockchain with cryptocurrency, but blockchain is so much more than cryptocurrency. And these concentric circles tell a story about how, yes, Bitcoin is a form of blockchain, and cryptocurrency includes blockchain, but blockchain includes so much more. And approximately 3 years ago, of all of the products being developed that included a blockchain, only 15% were developed that included a cryptocurrency underlying. That means 85% were designed to encompass blockchain capabilities that didn't include crypto. And ultimately, a blockchain is really just a database. So as we move forward together, and I offer recommendations using the thumbs up, it's valuable for us to make sure to separate the concepts of blockchain, which is not even any one thing into itself. It's a set of tools and technologies that happen to have some common features. And it's ultimately, they're all ultimately forms of databases. And crypto, people don't realize that the word crypto comes from what is hidden. And it refers to the growing set of cryptocurrencies or digital currencies. So the best way to move forward with the definition is to really focus on the features of what the collective body of blockchain can do. So as we go into these commonalities, it's valuable to point out some of these common features. So the first of which is that blockchain is based on creating a ledger. Old-fashioned accounting used ledgers. Those of us who work with audit trails see ledgers. You add an activity, it creates a line on the ledger. You make a change, it creates a line on the ledger. And so that's how data are added to the blockchain. Next feature is cryptography, and blockchains utilize cryptography in order to create hashes. So it can be almost any type of input. At Burst IQ, we input lots of different features, including images, files, raw data, can be pointers to the internet. Almost anything can be entered as an input, and it goes through a hash function that creates such a complex alphanumeric output that you cannot reverse engineer to figure out what the input is. And the output is all totally different from each other and encompasses whatever was part of that input. And this is the core technology that chains the blocks together. So as we think about how we create batches of data, it can be batches of transactions, it can be batches of input, say health information even, that as it's creating a hash of that block, it also includes the hash of the previous block. And then that information is included in the next block. And so since each subsequent block includes the hash of the previous block, that's what links them together. And this is also the feature that makes blockchain so tamper resistant and tamper evident, because if someone were to go and try to change data in, say, block 2, it would change the hash of block 2. But since the hash of block 2 is contained in block 3, then we'd have to change the hash of block 3. And so on, and so on, and so on down the chain, which would be an incredibly intensively involve intense computing capabilities. And the last common feature of all these blockchains is that storage is distributed. Instead of having a central database that we log into and we all access information in the same place, instead we use multiple servers that are called nodes. And these nodes can all talk to each other so that there's no single point of failure. This is how we get the term distributed ledger technology. Common blockchain features also include all of these on this slide, and a big part is how we can best design the capabilities to achieve the business cases that we are trying to get by including a blockchain technology in our architecture. When thinking about the types of blockchains out there, these are often placed on a grid where some are open and where anyone can see instant transactions, some are private, and with permissioning, the first blockchains were permissionless, where anyone could join and be pseudonymous, and permissioned, where you need permission to join. And today, still, there's so much focus. When people talk about blockchain, they tend to focus on the components that are public and permissionless. But blockchain is so much more than that today. In fact, there are over 1,000 platforms, not just the public and permissionless ones that were among the first. In fact, the nature of blockchains completely covers the grid in all different aspects, and some would straddle the lines. So we are facing an issue today where where blockchain platforms don't fit uniquely in any category or in any bucket. It's just important to see how broad the landscape is and how they can not just be private and permissioned, but they can include combinations. And for many of the technologies that we use at Burst IQ, we can layer blockchains. We can put a private blockchain on a public blockchain, or we can help clients put private applications on public blockchains. Most of the time, though, we work with private blockchains. It's just so much variety today about what organizations can do with blockchain. We're also seeing a wide variety of how blockchain nodes can be organized. Rather than just having a bunch of independent servers or nodes, there are consortia blockchain where groups get together and each contribute a meaningful component to the blockchain design and sharing. Or hybrid blockchains, where a private blockchain, for example, can be attached to a public blockchain in order to add additional attestation. So we're really seeing a lot of evolution of design. Now, this grid shows some of the common capabilities broken down by the public blockchains where anyone could send, approve, or read, and some different functions of the consortia, hybrid, and private blockchains that tend to involve smaller groups or permissioning or privacy. And I acknowledge that there are healthy debates about whether the consortia are hybrid or private are actually blockchains. As I told you in the beginning, there are drag out fights sometimes. But what we are seeing is that there are now tens of thousands of products being developed that involve private distributed ledger technologies that are calling themselves blockchain. On the international committees in which I serve, we had huge debates again in the beginning as to whether or not those radical private distributed ledger technologies should even be included in discussions on blockchain. But now it's become much more inclusive. So my hope is that instead of infighting amongst ourselves about what is the definition of blockchain, that we can learn from each other and come together in order to create more strength in numbers. With strength in numbers, we are in a better position to educate the public about what blockchain is and what it isn't, as well as advocate with our legislators and develop better products. And so as the definition continues to evolve, as is driven by market forces, we will continue to evolve with it. So now I'm going to talk about another feature of blockchain that's very common to the inherent capabilities and explain to you how people talk about it differently. So a common statement about blockchain is that blockchain is immutable, unchanging, incapable of being changed. Instead, I'm going to pose the question, is immutability absolute? What does that really mean? So actually, I'm gonna back up. So I'm gonna tell you a story. When I first gave my very first presentation on blockchain in January of 2019, I gave a presentation like this, and I was a little new to it. And so then I explained to the audience that blockchain is immutable. And I was heckled. It really threw me off. Audience members who were involved in blockchain heckled me during my presentation to tell me that I was wrong. So that made a big impression. And so then a couple weeks later, I went to an event at Mike Henson's office. Mike Henson was there. And I asked this group of blockchain professionals, there were about 45 people there. I raised my hand and I said, isn't blockchain immutable? And they said, no way, you idiot. And it really struck me and made me wonder how best to talk about this capability. As I became more involved in international committees, some of my colleagues pointed out to me that a good reference starting point for how we think about immutability comes from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology guidance. And they talk about how most publications on blockchain technology describe blockchain ledgers as being immutable. But NIST insists that this is not strictly true. They are tamper evident and tamper resistant. They cannot be considered completely immutable because there are situations in which the blockchain can be modified. Big. And so today, when I interact with people, I say, what do you really mean when you say that blockchain is immutable? Do you refer to the concept that it has very strong capabilities and that the ledger is inherently tamper evident and tamper resistant? Or do you mean carved in stone and will last forever? When people say, oh no, blockchain will last forever, I say, okay, how long is forever? 5 years? 10? What will we even recognize blockchain 10 years from now? You know, if we were involved in a blockchain conference in 2013, would we even recognize what it is today? If we think 10 years into the future, will we recognize what it's become? How do we know what the technology will be doing and what it will be capable of, especially during the era of quantum computing? Well, we have different mechanisms for hashes at that time. So, and in healthcare, we can't store data forever. We don't want to. And so we deliberately design our ledgers so that they can be archived. Sometimes the organization will request a modification during the project. So the best approach that I can recommend to this audience is that we just ask people what they mean when they're talking about immutability so that we can still get on the same page. The same one concept applies to decentralization. So much of blockchain is described as being decentralized. So what does that mean? And is decentralization absolute? I'm going to argue that it's not as an absolute or universal statement, and partly because we have so many capabilities within the blockchains that we have today. It's possible that some blockchains have much more decentralization than others. But I'm going to argue that centralization, decentralization exists on a continuum of dimensions. And here are just a couple of dimensions, and I quite honestly believe that there are 9 dimensions, and some of those additional dimensions can be considered subdimensions of these. When we consider architectural, most people say, oh, as long as there's multiple nodes, it's decentralized. Well, that's only one way of thinking about it. And when I ask people, I say, that's awesome that you have a 20 node network. That's great. So how do you host your nodes? And they say, well, all on AWS. Say, that's not very decentralized. Where do you, how do you manage the operations? Well, we have a group that does that. Well, that's not very decentralized. Who builds your apps? You have apps on top. And so it's thinking about blockchain with more complexity when we talk about operations. And when we talk about decentralization, and that's particularly true when we talk about governance, and I just spent the last 2 years working on the IEEE Governance Committee to determine how best to frame standards around governance. And it's much more complex because there are so many dimensions of governance, because you also have to make decisions on who's going to pay for it and who's going to operate it and who controls the legal component and who's responsible if there's a breach or a loss, and how do you maintain uptime? And all of these questions need to be addressed. And so it just becomes more complex. So as long as you can consider that decentralization is just more complex than the number of nodes, then we can come to, again, more commonalities. So the last feature I'm going to talk about with some blockchain components involves smart contracts. Now, it's valuable to know that smart contracts are not contracts and they're not necessarily smart. So these are cloud-based code-based programs that execute automatically when certain terms are met, and they can have many benefits for the middleware and the layer of communication. We at First IQ can implement up to about 20 layers of smart contracts in order to achieve governance using code. And we also use smart contracts to manage permissioning. So there's lots of different capabilities. I just wanted to put this term out there so that you are familiar with it as it comes up later. Okay. So since most of you are familiar with cryptocurrency, I'm going to talk about some use cases of blockchain that do not involve cryptocurrency so that you can become aware of how broadly this is accepted today. Here are just some basic stats, and I provided the reference source at the end of each of them. Yeah, from 2022 to 2030, the worldwide blockchain technology industry is expected to grow at 85.9% compound annual growth rate. Even the third bullet point, 60% of chief information officers across industries report that they are on the verge of incorporating blockchain in their infrastructure. For the last one, blockchain was acknowledged as a critical component of corporate infrastructure by 53% of C-level executives, determined by Gartner. These are real numbers, and this shows a lot more progress. In fact, of the top 10 companies using blockchain today, you can see like Adobe. What do we think of Adobe? Adobe's using Ethereum, and they are the top blockchain user among corporates today. And you'll recognize many of these other names. Anthem uses Hyperledger Fabric. So there's a diversity of blockchains that are being used by these corporate entities just to show how broadly this is becoming accepted. Walmart has been using blockchain to manage the food supply chain since 2016, but they made the biggest advance in September of 2019 when they mandated that all parties in the supply chain, from the growers to the shippers to the distributors, had to adopt their technology, IBM Food Trust, or be dropped as a supplier. Walmart tracks all leafy green lettuce in their stores using blockchain. They had previously started with pilots on mangoes and pork, and they continue to broaden the uses. And now one of their big goals is to put their pharmaceutical supply chain on blockchain. So every time you walk into a Walmart today, you can recognize that you are interacting with the blockchain, and that Walmart has enabled tracking to go from public health surveillance, which typically took 6 days to track the source of contamination to a farm, and gotten it down to 2 seconds. With health blockchains, where I specialize, here are the specific stats. You can see tremendous growth expected until 2030. What really strikes me is that Forbes predicts that by 2025, 55% of healthcare applications will include a blockchain component. And also in just 2 years, that the use of blockchain will save healthcare over $100 billion. And some people say, well, wait a minute, can blockchain really be used for healthcare? Absolutely. But it requires proper design principles for compliance. And you have to build the compliance into the technology itself, not just the application layer, but we have to design it into the blockchain itself. And also, it's valuable to note that compliance is not just about meeting some check marks for your technology, but compliance is the approach that your company takes to make sure that you have put in place good administrative safeguards and good physical safeguards of your technology, as well as meeting the unique technical components that have to be built into the technology. So I'm going to share with you some of the work that I do instead of just telling stories from the internet so that I can relate most closely and be able to answer your questions at the end of this session. So the first is governments are very involved in technology, and I'm only going to talk about the ones that I am involved in. In 2022, the Canadian government convened a panel, and I was actually the only American invited to serve on healthcare working group. Their goal with creating standards and having a specific healthcare working group was to determine how best to utilize blockchain to deliver health records and manage health records for Indigenous populations. And it's really powerful how much the country is investing in trying to use modern technology to do more for remote patient populations. Also, I've been serving on the European Union Blockchain Observatory and Forum for about 2.5 years. This was a committee that was created by the European Commission to advise the European Commission about how best to approach issues involving blockchain. And in 2021, the Commission requested a report about how best to use blockchain for healthcare. So they convened some of us who work in health blockchains in order to provide prescriptive advice about how to move forward. The Commission is trying to be very proactive. And one of the issues that they asked us to address is, can blockchain be consistent with the General Data Protection Regulations right to be forgotten? This is one of the debates that comes up periodically because of the way that blockchain manages an enduring ledger. Can we meet the requirements for the right to be forgotten? I was thoroughly preparing for a drag-out debate. I had written extensively and cited that there are 7 different published sources about how you can delete with different capabilities involving a blockchain, some of which is just deleting the component that's completely off-chain. For health blockchains, we actually delete on-chain if we have to. There are 7 different published methods for doing this. I was so prepared, and it ended up being a complete non-issue. The Commission brought some of its own experts to, and I said, okay, let's talk about the right to be forgotten. And they're like, what? So it does require careful design, but even in areas that have very restrictive privacy policies, organizations have found ways to meet these requirements. I'm just really excited about how much the European Commission is trying to advance blockchain technology in the European Union and utilizing it as a component for assisting with interoperability of healthcare records. So here are some projects that I was personally did with my colleagues at First IQ. A couple years ago during COVID, we managed vaccine data. States contracted with us to manage their vaccine process. So it was their vaccine supply chain, all of their scheduling, all of their medical records, and we used a blockchain to push data into electronic health records and push it to state registries. So also, I got to work on a project. The NIH came to us in 2021 and asked us to manage a process of storing molecular compounds on a blockchain to manage with the granular consent, so very fine-grained consent contracts or smart contracts in order to create drug synthesis. And the NIH has published widely about this, and they believe that this is an option that's going to help advance drug development because you can better manage intellectual property. Another project that we have worked on at First IQ was with Intermountain Healthcare starting in 2017. This was our first enterprise level implementation for a healthcare organization. And we designed the capabilities to bring together 10, I think it's 10. I often forget how many silos there are, but silos within Intermountain Healthcare so that they could really target and provide nuanced analyses of the actual health outcomes and costs of delivering surgeries. And over 4 years, Intermountain Healthcare saved $90 million. That's real money. They had created a spin-off company called Empiric Health and had used our BurstIQ blockchain platform in over 600 hospitals since 2017, saving money everywhere they go. BurstIQ has since purchased this technology, so we deliver this service ourselves. So these are real life capabilities. The last is we recently contracted with the state of Colorado. We won an award from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to help modernize Colorado's Medicaid. And we will be using blockchain to integrate 233 data silos for Medicaid data in Colorado. We had to be inspected by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They gave us the thumbs up. And so blockchain will be used for Medicaid data in Colorado. So these are just a few examples, but I hope that it helps you see how blockchain has evolved significantly beyond cryptocurrency into many practical applications and is making a difference in many industries. So now as we talk about the diversity of blockchains, I'm going to go back and include cryptocurrency. The goal of this discussion is not to offer opinions or conclusions, but to raise questions. And do blockchain technologies promote socially good outcomes for individuals or society? Can we use blockchain to reduce socioeconomic inequalities? I'm also going to offer recommendations, but I just hope that this inspires you to think more deeply about what we can do. So starting out with some critical ethical components, it's so important to first start with what is your mission and vision as you are using a blockchain? And who are you trying to help? How can you help that population with using a blockchain? When BurstIQ was founded, they had a critical mission to do good in third world countries and include healthcare more broadly. They were the very first company that uses blockchain to join the United Nations Global Compact and make a commitment to the world that they are going to fight for social justice and try to advance healthcare in the world. We also became members of OECD in order to help with financial equity in underserved and underprivileged communities. This drives our commitment and drives our staff and employees because we know that we're part of something good. As part of establishing your mission and values, it's valuable to ask, do your advisors and board members represent the people you're trying to help? Can they really advocate for them? And are you held accountable for upholding your mission and values? How can you become more accountable to achieve those goals that you set out for social good? Next, I'm going to talk about the evolution into Web3, because I believe that this is also part of social good. We were familiar, some of us remember when the internet was first started, which dates me a little bit, and you could log in and only read a website. And over time, we had the capability of posting information and creating it more interactive, which is now retroactively referred to as Web 2. And now, starting in 2020, we're really seeing a movement toward a different distributed mechanism for managing data in which individuals can have more capability to own their own data. In fact, one of the reasons that's driving this is because people produce amazing content and publish it on the internet. But in the Web 2 environment, when you publish something to Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, they own what you publish and they profit from it completely. You don't get anything. There are other, like YouTube, Spotify, the App Store, that provide some compensation to the content creators. But the movement now is for individuals to have more ownership and control. And currently, about 80% of the infrastructure designed for Web3 is founded on blockchain. as we see an influx of privacy legislation as well, that is driving individuals to have more visibility and control over their data, we are seeing more and more states come to give individuals more rights. While we don't know exactly what the future will hold, we do definitely see a trend. We see a trend that individuals are not just going to have right to access and right to share, but right to control how information is being used. And we believe eventually they'll have more rights to sell their data. Moving on to the ethics of security of blockchain networks. There have been many use cases that talk about cybersecurity. And some people say, oh, a blockchain is the only security that you need. Is that really true? It's very secure. But blockchain can also create its own security risks. Now, some of these are ubiquitous with being connected to the internet, but some are unique to blockchain. And it's important for us to become more aware of the risks that we can potentially introduce to how data or assets are being managed. Now, granted, the primary security risks involve the platform that you choose, and that private platforms are inherently more vulnerable than some of the bigger public ones just because of the design of how there's a smaller group of individuals. But it also depends on the degree of programming that's performed too, and whether or not the programming was good. You can have a very secure database and a very weak blockchain. So it's valuable to think through, how do we best manage security? And also, when we think about attacks on blockchain, they don't necessarily attack the blockchain itself, but the processes attached to the network. So the majority of hacks are on cross-chain bridges, the smart contracts that manage the protocols, people's hot wallets that store their crypto keys or their crypto, and of course, social engineering, people clicking on the wrong links. So I like to emphasize blockchain is software, not magic. It's got some tremendous strengths, but there's human beings behind it to some level. And humans ultimately wrote the original codes. They're constantly improved, but humans are involved, and nothing that humans are involved in is going to be perfect. So what I recommend is to perform an ethical risk assessment where you identify where things can go wrong and try to be proactive about addressing those. And there are many different ways that it can go wrong. And these are just some of the examples. I provided an example of the Blockchain Ethical Design Framework for Healthcare, which is a document that I worked on with the Government Blockchain Association, where we provide a framework that individuals can use and adopt beyond healthcare as well, in order to understand, what do we need to know? What can go wrong so that we can be more thoughtful and proactive? And also use ethical software manufacturing practices. It's not just programming, it's programming that involves people's assets or people's data as part of the architecture stack. And if you are doing anything regulated, it has to be designed with privacy and security by design. And at Burst IQ, we hire white hat hackers to help us, and they perform penetration testing and try to break into our network because we feel responsible, because we need to know where our vulnerabilities are and we need to address them. And more organizations that use blockchain are pursuing certifications. We have SOC 2 Type 2 certification. We've had it for 5 years. Other blockchain organizations are also getting high trust certifications. Some that provide services to the federal government also get FedRAMP certified to meet the security requirements. And so my last ethical consideration is that it's valuable for us to consider blockchain trust differently. Blockchain itself can offer many features, but blockchain didn't cause the FTX fraud. But when FTX happened, we all saw that blockchain was implicated too. It wasn't blockchain. It was bad business practices. And so the only way we can really sustain trust is with ethical behavior, knowing that trust originates from ethical design and behaviors. Going into the financial components, which some of my colleagues are going to talk about in greater detail, absolutely blockchain is having a huge impact financially, not just with cryptocurrency, but the way banks are using different forms of blockchain. And it's expected that the blockchain industry will be worth $163 billion by 2029. Of course, banking has the greatest role among blockchain industries, but now cryptocurrency is becoming much more widely accepted. These are just examples of industries that accept cryptocurrency as payment. And as we talk about payment, how do we help people who don't have a bank account and don't have the capabilities to generate payments as effectively? This is a graph that shows areas of the world where the percentages of adults that have an account with a formal institution are very low. And there's been a lot of questions about, can cryptocurrency help? Can we reach them with using peer-to-peer networks? Well, it's possible that peer-to-peer networks will be effective, but it's also valuable to consider that our primary goal of doing that is to address social and economic inequities. But giving someone a cryptocurrency account doesn't put more money in the bank or their account. And is it appropriate for people who have often minimal financial resources to encourage them to invest in something speculative? In fact, the US Treasury reports that the cost of financial services are higher, not lower, for cryptocurrency transactions than banking. So it's just a valuable perspective as we're trying to help individuals and achieve better socioeconomic balance. So my recommendations are that we as a community can do a lot more to improve financial education and financial literacy. And if someone really does want a peer-to-peer capability, to encourage them to pursue cryptocurrency that has more stability or lower cost transactions, or both. Okay, we can't talk about crypto without talking about the hacks. So it's just valuable to know how the hacks have played out over the years, with 3.8 billion stolen last year. Where is it typically stolen? You can see in this graph that in 2022, the majority of hacks were on the decentralized finance protocols. Most of those were on blockchain bridges, such as cross-chain bridges, but also hacks of the smart contracts. So we're not going to prevent hackers, but we can implement more ethical approaches to how we protect assets. So along the lines of security, it's always important to perform good code testing and really test your system against simulated attacks. There are fantastic tools to monitor transactions for suspicious activity and to build automatic processes that can pause protocols. And some people have said, well, I don't want my network to go down. But is it better to create a brief period of inconvenience or to address the loss of all of the assets in the network? So it's just important to consider how we can be more ethical in our approaches. And we can't talk about ethics without talking about the environmental considerations. So many people say, oh, blockchain, it's terrible for the environment. You shouldn't go into blockchain. But that depends entirely on the consensus mechanism that's used by the blockchain. Now, because the earliest blockchains used mining, where there was a competition among the parties, the servers, to see who could solve this puzzle first and be rewarded with cryptocurrency. That's proof of work. And proof of work is the nature that uses a lot of electricity. But it's important to know that there are almost 80 consensus mechanisms available to choose from today to get all of the nodes to agree with each other. And those who are familiar with Ethereum, remember the big merge in September of last year when Ethereum converted from proof of work to proof of stake and greatly reduced their electricity. And in healthcare, we use proof of authority. And because healthcare involves parties that we have contractually trusted with, we have an extremely efficient and low-cost mechanism for getting the nodes to agree with each other. So let's understand this Bitcoin mining operation a bit more. When you hear about a mine, it's just that they have a pooled resources or have established many of the processors in order to mine. In fact, in the United States, it's believed that there are 34 large-scale Bitcoin mining operations as identified by the New York Times. And this is the largest mine. It's Riot Platforms mine in Rockdale, Texas, that uses about the same amount of electricity as the nearest 300,000 homes. And so it is valuable to talk about carbon emissions. Carbon emissions do not result from the Bitcoin mining process. They result from using fossil fuels to create the electricity that powers the Bitcoin mining operations. But it is valuable to note that Riot Platforms generates almost 2 million tons of carbon emissions every year based on the electricity that they use. When Ethereum changed through the merge, they had a 99.9% reduction in energy consumption, which is a much more sustainable approach. And it's valuable to create some comparisons. How many terawatt hours are used by proof of stake Ethereum now versus YouTube? No one talks about YouTube when we talk about energy use. It's just valuable to put this all in perspective. So for conclusion about environmental issues, it's just valuable to note that any impact to the environment is dependent on the nature of blockchain that's being used, specifically the consensus mechanism that's being used, and the extent to which electricity is created from fossil fuels. So I hope that this audience can take away, we have an opportunity to learn more about energy sources and operators, and that the brilliance in this room can help us create sustainably sourced energy. So now I am really eager to hear the speakers that are following me. And after those speakers are done, I'm gonna come back briefly and talk about how to get involved.